Well, welcome everyone to this edition of Hoodwinked. And I'm Earl Hatley. I'm an enrolled member of the Abenaki Nation of Missisquoi. And I'm a board member of BALE, Building a Local Economy. And welcome to the Hoodwinked series based on this in part. And this is Hoodwinked in the Hothouse, which is a booklet by a consortia of groups. One of my favorites, of course, is Indigenous Environmental Network. And that's how I got my copy, was from Tom Goldtooth, which I always say at the beginning. And this series episode tonight is going to be about nuclear power. And one of my favorite topics, because when I became an organizer back in the early 70s, I started out as a nuclear power activist. And in Oklahoma, we had 3 nuclear power processing facilities there that were run by Kerr McGee, who was also mining in New Mexico on Dene Navajo lands there. And so it was in 1974 that I met Karen Silkwood, who was stealing and copying papers out of the facility at Crescent, the plutonium facility that she was working at the time. And so I had the honor and privilege of knowing the person that she was bringing all of those documents to in Oklahoma City. And I was reading all of that at the time, and she was sneaking this stuff out and bringing it there. And so I happened to be one of the people that was waiting for her that night that she was killed as she was driving in with what we were sure was going to be the smoking guns. And I also have a long story about what happened that next morning when I went up to the scene and met accidentally, I guess, with the highway patrol and other people. But that was how I got started. And so we ended up shutting down all those facilities eventually. And nuclear power, yeah, that's something else. And so my friend Brian Tokar is here to talk about nuclear power. He's been an activist all of his life, as I have too. And he is with the Institute for Social Ecology, has been for the start of that, and has a long history, which I'll let him explain to you. So without any further ado, I'd like for y'all to welcome a great activist, a longtime activist here in Vermont, one that I think everyone already knows anyway. But please give a warm Vermont welcome to Brian Tokar.
Well, thank you, Earl, for that introduction. And it's great to be here at BALE this evening to talk about nuclear power. And in many ways, it's the issue I got my start around as well. I was always interested in environmental issues from high school, but a lot of other things intervened in terms of my activist focuses, like the war in Vietnam during its later years, and community issues in the city of Cambridge where I was in school, and anti-racist stuff when I was in high school, and a lot of other things. And then back in around 1975, I think it was, I was a student at MIT, and we learned that the Institute had cut a secret deal with the State Department and the government of the Shah of Iran, who was, as probably you all know, put in power following a CIA-initiated coup back in the 1950s, and he was basically a U.S. client, probably the leading U.S. client in the Middle East at the time. And MIT arranged with the Shah of Iran to train 2 groups of students in nuclear engineering at triple the normal MIT tuition at the time. And we exposed this, and it became a huge public issue, which it wasn't supposed to be. And eventually, it got cut short a year early. They were supposed to admit 2 groups of students. There were only 1. The Boston Globe discovered many years later that most of those nuclear engineering students stayed in the U.S., but of course the ones who went back to Iran are the people running the nuclear program in Iran currently. And we can maybe claim a little bit of credit for there being half as many of them as there would have been otherwise. And shortly after that, we started hearing about increasingly large civil disobedience actions against plans to build a nuclear power plant in Seabrook on the coast of New Hampshire, and got involved in that. And anti-nuclear issues were really my main focus for the next several years before moving on to a lot of other things. And then around the middle of the first decade of the 2000s, getting back into energy and climate issues and confronting this new wave of advocacy for nuclear power. And right now, in addition to my work with the Institute for Social Ecology, I'm part of a small group of people who were active in the New England Regional Anti-Nuclear Network, which was called the Clamshell Alliance, after the clam flats on the coast of Seabrook, the coast of New Hampshire, that were endangered by the nuclear construction. And we've just, for the first time in maybe the first time ever, established a current, up-to-date, state-of-the-art website in the name of the Clamshell Alliance. So you can check that out at clamshellalliance.com. There was an older site, .org, and when that got dropped, it got picked up by one of the usual spam operators. So that's why it's .com now. It was the closest thing that was available. So I'm finding myself back in the midst of a lot of these issues. And of course, in the intervening years, there have been many cycles of claims that nuclear power is due for a major revival in the United States and internationally. It happened in the 80s, it happened in the early 2000s. But I think what's different about the current wave of nuclear advocacy is there are many more high-profile figures promoting nuclear power and claiming that it needs to be seen as part of the solution to the climate crisis that we're all facing. And it's a wide range of people, you know, from Bill Gates, who's of course been all over the media promoting nuclear power, to Senator Cory Booker in New Jersey, who's seen as moderately progressive on a lot of issues, to the filmmaker Oliver Stone, who earlier this summer put out a documentary that I'm told is an example of the most blatant pro-nuclear propaganda that anybody's seen from any outlet that has significant visibility in quite some time. So there are a lot of big names behind it. There's also a lot of collaboration from the mainstream media. I think of an incident a few years ago where simultaneously, within about a week, all the major national news outlets, the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, etc., all came out with stories claiming that the environmental movement was rethinking nuclear power. It turned out that these stories had been planted by a notorious PR operator by the name of Michael Schellenberger, who claims to be an eco-modernist, meaning using ecological language to promote all kinds of horrible technologies, from GMOs to nuclear power and everything in between. And he had the clout to get these stories planted in the major media. One of the fallouts from that was Michael Brune, who's the director of the National Sierra Club at the time, wrote an open letter to all those media outlets saying that he had never in all his life and all his time of being a high visibility environmental figure had never been so badly and systematically misquoted. And that eventually came out thanks to Michael Broom's intervention. But it was a real example for me of how the mainstream media is behind this push for nuclear power. And of course, over the last 20 years, there have been attempts at reviving nuclear power here in the US as well as in Europe, in some places in the world, particularly in East Asia. Nuclear construction has been ongoing in China and many other places. And we're hearing a lot of very similar claims to claims that were made in the 80s and early 2000s and other times, that we're going to see a new generation of nuclear power plants that are cheaper and safer and accident-proof and what have you. And the claims, I will argue, are no more credible now than they were 20 years ago or 40 years ago or 60 years ago. So I'm going to try in the next 15 minutes or so to do two things, which is first give you a little bit of a picture of the status of the so-called nuclear revival, excuse me, that began around 2000 with the G.W. Bush administration, and then run through point by point the issues that make it very clear to me that nuclear power is absolutely not part of the solution to the climate crisis, that it's as much of a hazard and a boondoggle as it's always been. So what's currently happening with this wave of nuclear plants that various countries and various companies were trying to build starting 20 years ago? Well, a number of reactors began to be planned during the Bush era, particularly in the southern states. And out of those, only one site by the name of Vogtle, V-O-G-T-L-E, in the state of Georgia remains. It's a dual reactor project. Over the 10 years it's been under construction, the cost has gone from $14 billion to over $30 billion. And after 10 years, it's still under construction. Now they're saying it may open next year. What's kept that one project alive, in contrast to all of the others, is they've been able to leverage the ability to charge current ratepayers for reactors while they're still under construction. So typically, utilities, commercial utilities in the U.S. are guaranteed a rate of return based on the power they're putting out. And here in New England, we fought a battle during the construction of Seabrook around this very concept. The utilities wanted to start charging customers for the electricity that Seabrook would be producing in the future. It was called the Construction Works in Progress provision. And people fought it and defeated it here in New England during the late 70s. And it's one of the reasons they were only able to build one of the two reactors that were originally planned for the site in Seabrook. But in Georgia, they're allowing it, despite the efforts of a lot of activists on the ground to fight it. And therefore, the plant in Georgia, the pair of plants in Georgia, are the only ones from the early 2000 wave that are actively under construction and that maybe have a chance of beginning to operate. The story in Europe is very similar. People point to France as a country that represents a successful example of deployment of nuclear power. France gets about 70% of its electricity from nuclear power, but it's been steadily declining for about 10 years. It used to be closer to 75 or 80%. France has about half of the total nuclear generation in all of Europe. Why? Because nuclear power in France is even more explicitly than here, part of the military-industrial complex. Funding for nuclear power in France is more analogous to funding for military procurement in the US. Money is no object. They spend as much as they need to keep plants operating and keep trying to address the various problems that arise. But they're running into some new problems, namely, or most specifically, that they're having trouble running their cooling systems because the rivers they depend on are so much warmer than they used to be that in many parts of France they're no longer cool enough to cool the reactors. So they have to shut them down for part of the summer when the water is too warm. One new nuclear project was proposed in France, in the northwest of the country, in a little town called Flamanville, that began construction about, I don't remember when it actually began, but it's 10 years behind schedule. It's 12 billion euros over budget. And it's a similar story in many ways, despite the fact that the French keep throwing money at their nuclear industry. It's a pretty similar story to what we're seeing here in the US. France, like the US, claims that they're on the verge of developing a new generation of better nuclear plants, and those are projected to come online in 2035. Obviously, too late to make the difference in terms of the climate situation. In both Finland and the UK, there are plants that have been under construction using French technology, supported by French corporations. And it's the same story. In Finland, a French-built nuke finally opened last year, 13 years behind schedule, at least 3 times its original projected cost. There's one in the UK, whose cost has run up to £20 billion and counting. That's been under construction for many years, and they're saying that they're now projecting that it may open in 2026. So nuclear power on those grounds alone is never going to, even if all of the other issues could be put aside, and I'll explain why they can't, even if those issues could be put aside, there's no way nuclear power can be a reliable solution to the climate crisis. 2 more issues before we go on to the broad overview of systemic problems. One is the claim about new technologies, and the second is the whole question of the supposed need for baseload power, which is mythical also. As I mentioned early on, nuclear advocates are claiming more aggressively than ever before that we're on the verge of seeing a whole new generation of nuclear technologies, plants that are safer, plants that are smaller, plants that are easier to build, plants that they claim will even be proliferation proof, that won't have the problem of nuclear material potentially being diverted to military uses. These claims have as little credibility as they had when they were made 20 years ago and 40 years ago, in my opinion. One case in point, which has been in the press a lot, is the project that Bill Gates is funding in Wyoming. It's a sodium-cooled, as opposed to water-cooled, smaller reactor. And he's been quoted in the media repeatedly saying that, this is going to solve the problems that have not been solved up till now related to nuclear power. Arnie Gundersen, who's a former nuclear engineer turned whistleblower. His organization used to be based out of Burlington. He and his wife have semi-retired to Florida in just the last couple of years. But Arnie Gundersen posted an open letter to Bill Gates. It was on, you can find it on Counterpunch. I think it's been reposted in a number of other places. And he pointed out that one, this reactor is still largely speculative. It's still mainly in the design phase. It's closer to being I can't remember if it was Gunderson's phrase or something else I read. It's more like a PowerPoint reactor than a functioning reactor. So it's still in its design phase. And everything we know about it so far suggests that it's very similar to a notorious plant in Michigan that was built in the 1960s, that partially melted down, that was responsible for the phrase, it was a book title, it was even a Gil Scott-Heron song once, "We almost lost Detroit." That's the technology that Bill Gates is saying is going to save us. The whole notion of smaller, more modular reactors, that's been studied, and people who have evaluated those projects critically have concluded that they're only economical if they're bundled together in larger facilities. So you basically have the same problem we have now in terms of centralization, except that the cost per kilowatt hour is significantly higher for an assemblage of 5 or 6 small nukes compared to one or two big ones like they have in Georgia. Another famous nuclear whistleblower, Arjun Makhijani, based out of Washington, D.C., is one of the people who's revealed that from industry analysis of industry studies and a lot of other important debunking of the myths of so-called new generation nukes. Even Gregory Jasko, who's a nuclear engineer who was the head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission during the Obama years, now believes that nuclear power should be banned. He had a really interesting commentary in the Washington Post back in May of 2019, which is still on their website. And I'll just read you a couple of sentences. He says, "Despite working in the industry for more than a decade, I now believe that nuclear power's benefits are no longer enough to risk the welfare of people living near these plants. I became so convinced that years after departing office, I've now made alternative energy development my new career, leaving nuclear power behind. The current and potential costs in lives and dollars are just too high." And that's Obama's head of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission. Finally, and very briefly, before I go on to listing some of the more systemic issues, is this myth that we need backup power equivalent to the total amount of renewable energy that's deployed. This is something we hear over and over again, and people like Cory Booker and lots of others say, well, if we don't have nuclear power to back up our wind and solar infrastructure, that we're going to have to continue to rely on fossil fuels. That is the only so-called dispatchable, is the utilities lingo for it, reliable, on 24/7 form of electricity production that doesn't produce greenhouse gases. And we'll talk in a minute about why even that claim isn't true, that it doesn't produce greenhouse gases. It turns out that places from California to states in Australia to several European countries have been running fairly consistently on 20-25% renewable energy, and in shorter intervals of time, from a day to several days, as high as 100% renewable energy without needing to rely on so-called baseload power. And it's all about adjusting the grid so that it is capable of responding to fluctuations and drawing on different sources of supply from across a region and matching the characteristics of the energy coming in. It's mostly done with software. And they've learned to do this in Europe, and they've learned to do this in a lot of other places. And the current estimate is that at most we need 20% of the renewable energy supply to be backed up with so-called dispatchable power. And we can easily meet that with hydroelectric and geothermal and other technologies. And that's even relying on current technology in terms of battery storage. If we're able to perfect battery storage on a larger scale and address some of the broader environmental problems that come from the production of batteries, especially reliance on mining of more minerals to produce the lithium and cobalt and nickel and everything else that current battery technology relies on. If we could solve those problems, which to me are inherently much more solvable than the systemic problems of nuclear power, we'll need even less so-called dispatchable power, and that terminology will eventually just fade into the ancient history of utility engineers, and nobody else will remember it. So, I want to highlight six systemic issues, and then a seventh that I need to add to it, that to me clinch the argument that nuclear power is not just currently incapable, but is inherently, by its nature, incapable of being a climate solution. First, of course, has to do with cost, and I've already hinted at some of that, looking at some of the massive increases in cost for projects currently under construction. If you look at the current data, which is now about 3 or 4 years old, on the lifetime cost of electricity from different sources, and this is a chart that you can find in any number of places online. There is actually a version of it reposted in one of the basic statements on the new Clamshell Alliance website. But if you don't want to trust that, you can find it in any number of independent sources. It's called the levelized cost of energy. That's the cost of a unit of energy from different sources. What you see is that in the last 10 years, the cost of wind power has gone down by a third. It's gone down by 2/3. The cost of photovoltaic power has gone down by 90%, much steeper decline and over a much shorter window of time. The cost of electricity from gas, and it varies from different gas-driven technologies, but it's crept down a little bit over the last several years, but it's also been pretty volatile. The cost of nuclear power has steadily risen per kilowatt hour. There was a significant jump in the 3 or 4 years following the accident at Fukushima in Japan, and of course they're still dumping radioactive water into the Pacific Ocean from the aftermath of that accident. And nuclear regulators in most countries realize, every time there's a nuclear accident, they learn new things about what can go wrong. So regulators in most countries impose some increased safety requirements so that some of the unanticipated problems that emerged at Fukushima will hopefully not happen again. And that increases the cost of electricity from those reactors. And of course, the industry complains about it, but these are necessary measures. So there was a significant jump 3 or 4 years after Fukushima, but there's also an overall trend of rising prices, and it has to do with the cost of construction, the cost of every other aspect. We know that wind and solar at this point, to build new facilities, it's not only cheaper than building new fossil-fueled electricity generators, but we're very quickly getting to the point, and we're already at the point in many locations around the world where it's cheaper to build new solar and wind facilities than to operate and maintain existing fossil fuel facilities. And now the price of batteries are coming down to the point where very soon the cost of solar and wind power with batteries is going to be cheaper than operation and maintenance costs of existing fossil fuel generators. So cost is one key issue. Carbon emissions. Splitting atoms to produce electricity in the moment doesn't appear to be a major source of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions, but it takes a lot more than an operating reactor to generate nuclear power. The uranium has to be mined. It has to be processed and refined to raise the proportion of the highly radioactive isotope of uranium that's necessary to trigger a nuclear chain reaction. These are both extremely energy intensive and therefore carbon intensive processes. Reactor construction, the nuclear power plant uses a vast amount of concrete, which is one of the most carbon intensive materials there is. We don't know how much it's going to cost in either dollars or emissions to address the nuclear waste issue, because after decades and decades, we're no closer to solving that one. And many people have speculated that the life cycle emissions from nuclear power are probably pretty comparable to the emissions from fossil fuels, not any better. We have all the issues that I'm sure everybody's very familiar with. The problem of nuclear accidents. Again, every time there's another one, we learn more about what can go wrong. It happened at 3 Mile Island in the 70s. It happened at Chernobyl in the 1980s. And then, of course, most recently in Fukushima in Japan in 2011. And again, the continuing releases of radioactive water to try to address the continuing, more than a decade later, aftermath of that disaster. The waste issue I've already mentioned. It's inherently, it's fundamentally unsolved. From Vermont Yankee down in southern Vermont, they're shipping so-called low-level waste to Texas. The fuel rods, the high-level nuclear waste is still sitting in casks at the old plant site, and everybody's waiting for a solution to the problem of high-level nuclear waste. It's very likely they won't find one. The problem of low-level radiation was one that we used to talk about a lot back in the 1970s, when there was increasing evidence that low levels of radiation exposure were proportionately even more hazardous than higher levels, that effects began to appear at a much earlier stage, at much lower levels of exposure than were previously thought by just extrapolating back from some of the most extreme instances of exposure by nuclear plant workers and others. That research has not really kept up as much, but the older research is still there to examine. And then the problem of proliferation of nuclear weapons, which is inherent to all nuclear technologies. And what comes with that is the need to vigilantly safeguard nuclear materials, which of course leads to the further militarization of energy systems in general. So I think those 6 issues really add up to an overwhelming case that nuclear power is still the wrong answer. The last piece I want to mention is the false promise of nuclear fusion. Every time there's a minor breakthrough in nuclear fusion research, it makes huge headlines, and we're told that pretty soon we're going to be able to get unlimited free energy from fusing hydrogen atoms in water, and that's just not true. The experiments that have been in the news most recently at Lawrence Berkeley Labs, these are fusion reactions that operate over infinitesimal amounts of time. I think I think the time scale is of the order of 1 in 10 to the 15th seconds or something like that. Um, Also, the physical scale of these reactions, they happen in these tiny little reactor vessels about the size of a pea. And we're told these are breakthroughs. And they have recently, for the first time, accomplished getting more energy out of the fusion reaction than is contained in the laser beam that triggers the fusion reaction. But they're not talking about the energy it takes to operate these hundreds of lasers that are shined on this tiny pea-sized object to trigger the reaction. Not to mention the cost of building these facilities, the cost of extracting the radioactive hydrogen, the tritium, which is necessary to have a viable fusion reaction. So there are vast number of unstated costs involved. And then nobody's even begun to imagine fusion reaction on a larger scale in any practical terms. So we don't know anything about the radiation damage to equipment, the effects of operating whatever equipment might exist someday, of the extremely high temperatures and pressures that they would almost certainly need to operate under. And in reality, these fusion experiments are mostly in the realm of weapons research. You know, they're always promoted as energy technology, but what they're really about is figuring out if there's a way to produce hydrogen bombs without needing a fission bomb to trigger it. That's the scientific question that these fusion experiments in Berkeley are actually designed to answer. They're not designed to answer questions about energy production at all. So, in summary, I think it's time to end the nuclear fantasy once and for all, to focus on renewable energy, solving some of the existing problems that we know can be solved in the realm of renewable energy and battery storage, and also addressing the fundamental problem of what kind of economy we live under, what kinds of consumption patterns we're taught to take for granted, and the ways in which this system continues to depend on endless growth and endless accumulation of capital to thrive. And if we can get to the bottom of the more fundamental problems with our current, not just energy system, but entire economic system, all of these problems can be solved without resorting to the kinds of outrageous and inherently too costly and too dangerous false solutions proposed by the nuclear industry. So I will end it there and open it up to discussion.